What if one simple decision turned your life into a nightmare? What if just standing outside your own home made you a suspect? Elijah Carter was a successful man, a tech expert, a homeowner, but none of that mattered when one neighbor's paranoia put him face to face with police brutality, humiliation, and injustice. But here's the twist, the real criminal? He was much closer than anyone thought. Where are you watching from? If you love stories that expose the truth and challenge injustice, subscribe to Inspiring Stories Told Now. Stay with us, because this story will leave you speechless. Elijah Carter never liked attention. He had chosen Oak Ridge Heights, Texas, for its quiet streets, manicured lawns, and promise of privacy. The gated community, with its sprawling two-story homes and uniform mailboxes, was a sanctuary for wealthy families and professionals. It wasn't exactly welcoming to people who looked like him, but Elijah had learned to ignore the microaggressions, the lingering stares, the cautious glances, the subtle clutches of purses when he walked by. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to live his life in peace. But peace was always conditional, especially for a black man in a place like this. It started with something small, something that, in any other world, wouldn't have mattered. Elijah had been noticing it for weeks. His Wi-Fi had been slowing down. He worked remotely as a cybersecurity consultant, and sluggish internet wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a red flag. He suspected someone was piggybacking off his network, siphoning bandwidth without permission. But today, when he finally decided to dig into his router logs, he found something far worse. An unknown device, connected for days, and still active. He frowned, clicking on the device details. The name wasn't random numbers or letters. It was labeled Oak Ridge 001. A deliberate name. A name that suggested whoever was using it wasn't just stealing internet. They wanted to blend in. His gut twisted. Elijah wasn't a paranoid man, but he knew how cyber threats worked. He had spent years tracking hacks, breaches, and stolen data. If someone had compromised his network, they could have access to more than just his Wi-Fi. His work files, his security cameras, even his personal accounts. His entire life. His jaw clenched as he clicked the option to kick all unknown devices off his network and reset the password. Not today. But his signal was weak inside the house, so he stepped outside onto the porch, his fingers tapping quickly on his phone screen as he set a new, stronger password. He barely noticed the warm Texas breeze against his skin, his focus laser-sharp. And that's when Karen Whitmore saw him. Karen never trusted Elijah. She wouldn't admit it outright, of course. She wasn't racist, she'd tell herself. She had black friends, though none that actually came over. But something about him had always made her uncomfortable. He didn't wave at her when she passed his house on her morning jog. He didn't attend the neighborhood block parties or linger on his lawn, making small talk like the other homeowners. He was quiet, kept to himself, always working on his laptop. And that was suspicious. But today was different. She had just stepped into her kitchen, sipping her organic green tea, when she glanced out the window and saw him standing in his driveway, hunched over his phone. He wasn't pacing, wasn't calling anyone, just standing there, tapping away, staring at his screen. A chill crawled up her spine. What was he doing? Her mind jumped to the worst conclusions. She had seen news reports, stories of hacking, identity theft, cybercrimes. Was that what he was doing? Was he breaking into someone's account? Watching someone? Her fingers tightened around her phone. She didn't have proof, but she didn't need it. Her gut told her something was wrong. Without another thought, she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Karen's voice was breathless, urgent. Yes, I need to report something suspicious. My neighbor, he's outside doing something with his phone. I don't know what it is, but it looks off. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Ma'am, what exactly is he doing? Karen glanced back at the window. Elijah hadn't moved. His fingers were flying across his phone screen. Plotting. She swallowed. I think he's hacking. He's just standing there, tapping away, looking around like he's watching people. It doesn't feel right. A pause. Then the dispatcher's voice again. Ma'am, is he approaching any homes? making threats. Karen's pulse quickened. Why were they asking her so many questions? Did they not understand the urgency? I don't know. She snapped. But I just know something isn't right. Can you send someone? Please. Another pause. Then, units are on the way. Stay inside, ma'am. Karen exhaled, her chest tight. And outside, Elijah had no idea his quiet afternoon was about to turn into his worst nightmare. The first thing Elijah noticed was the sirens. At first, he barely registered them. This was Texas, after all. Sirens weren't uncommon. But when the wailing grew louder and closer, his eyes flicked up from his phone just in time to see a black and white patrol car roll to a stop in front of his house. His stomach dropped. 2 officers stepped out. The first, Detective Ryan Calloway, was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his presence commanding. His right hand hovered near his belt, not on his gun, but close enough to send a message. The second, Officer Jessica Lane, had a more compact frame, her expression unreadable. But her eyes were sharp, scanning Elijah like he was already guilty of something. Elijah's grip tightened around his phone. What the hell was going on? The taller officer, Calloway, spoke first. His voice was steady, practiced. Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing? Elijah blinked. His heart pounded. Suspicious activity? His mouth felt dry as he tried to keep his voice level. I'm changing my Wi-Fi password. A beat of silence. Then Calloway's gaze flickered to Lane before turning back to Elijah. Do you live here? Elijah's blood turned to ice. His car was in the driveway. His name was on the damn mailbox. But he knew this game. He inhaled slowly, keeping his anger in check. Yeah, 3 years. Before Calloway could respond, a voice cut through the air. He's lying. Elijah turned, and there, standing on her porch, arms crossed like a self-appointed security guard, was Karen Whitmore. Her expression was triumphant, like she had just caught a criminal in the act. He's always outside doing something, she continued, her voice rising. Messing with his phone, looking around like he's watching people. I knew something was off about him. Elijah felt a sudden, searing rage coil in his gut. Are you serious right now? His voice was low, sharp. I was on my router settings. Because someone I don't know has been using my Wi-Fi. Karen scoffed. Oh, sure. And I'm supposed to believe that? Calloway's eyes narrowed. Sir, would you mind if we take a quick look at your router settings? Just to clear this up. Elijah clenched his jaw. He didn't have to prove a damn thing. But he also knew how quickly these things could escalate. His shoulders stiffened. His pulse pounded. Then, exhaling through gritted teeth, he unlocked his phone. Fine, he muttered. Take a look. Because deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The flashing red and blue lights painted the night in chaos. The sirens howled, piercing the quiet neighborhood like a war cry. Elijah Carter stood frozen on his porch, his phone still in his hand, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Why were their guns drawn? Why were they treating him like a criminal? His breath caught in his throat as Detective Ryan Calloway stepped forward, weapon raised, stance aggressive. His partner, Officer Jessica Lane, mirrored his movements, her fingers tight on her holster. Put your hands up. Calloway barked, his voice sharp, unwavering. Elijah's heart pounded. He lifted his hands slowly, palms open, showing them he had nothing. What the hell is this? His voice cracked, his confusion morphing into panic. Hands where we can see them. Step away from the phone. Calloway's voice was like a whip, each word slicing through Elijah's chest. Elijah barely had time to process before Calloway lunged forward, grabbing his arm with brute force. Before he could react, before he could even breathe, he was yanked down. His knees hit the pavement hard. A sharp, blinding pain shot up his legs. Then, a crushing weight on his back. Elijah gasped, his cheek smashing against the rough concrete, his breath stolen from his lungs. A knee, right between his shoulder blades, pressing down, pinning him. His arms wrenched behind him, the cold bite of steel snapping around his wrists. Stop. What are you? His voice was muffled, strangled, cut off by the sheer force keeping him down. He could barely move. He could barely breathe. The pressure in his chest was unbearable, like being crushed under a boulder. Around him, the world blurred. But the voices? The voices were crystal clear. A murmur rippled through the crowd that had formed along the sidewalk. Faces peered from behind curtains. Phones were out, cameras rolling. And then, above the sirens, above his own ragged breaths, came the shrill voice of Karen Whitmore. I told you. I told you he was up to something. Her voice was triumphant, like she had caught a wild animal in a trap. Her arms were crossed, standing on her perfectly decorated porch as if this was some twisted spectacle. I knew it. I knew he wasn't right, she continued, her voice grating, triumphant. Elijah clenched his teeth, rage bubbling under his ribs. This was her doing. This was all because she had seen him standing in his own damn driveway. And now? Now he was face down on the pavement, humiliated, treated like an animal, like a criminal, while she stood there like she was some kind of hero. Elijah gritted his teeth, forcing his voice steady. What the hell is happening? His voice came out raw, laced with restrained fury. Calloway's knee dug deeper into his back before he finally pulled away. Elijah was yanked upright, his wrists still bound behind him. Calloway stood in front of him, arms crossed, eyes cold. We got a report about suspicious cyber activity. Elijah's stomach twisted. Cyber activity? His eyes flicked toward Karen, who stood smugly watching, arms folded. This was because of her. His voice was sharp, incredulous. I fit the description. I'm standing in my own driveway. Calloway's expression didn't change. You matched the suspect description from the report. That's all we need to investigate. Elijah's blood boiled. A report from who? That woman. He nodded toward Karen, whose smirk faltered just slightly. You tackled me to the ground based on nothing but her paranoia? Calloway didn't flinch. Didn't care. Officer Jessica Lane, standing slightly behind Calloway, shifted uneasily, but she said nothing. Elijah's jaw clenched. This wasn't about a real crime. This was about putting him in his place. Through gritted teeth, Elijah forced his breathing steady. You have no right to detain me. I haven't done anything wrong. Calloway's lips curled into something bordering on amusement. Then you won't mind us checking your devices, will you? Elijah stiffened. His gaze darted toward his house. His laptop was still open inside. His personal files, his work, everything. They had no right to go through it. And they knew it. Officer Lane finally spoke, her voice smooth but firm. Let's check his devices. If there's nothing, we'll clear him and be on our way. Elijah's chest burned with frustration. You don't have a warrant. His voice was sharp, controlled. Calloway arched an eyebrow. You have a choice, Mr. Carter. Either cooperate, or we take you downtown. The threat hung in the air like a knife. The words settled deep in his bones, cold and absolute. He knew what that meant. If he resisted, even if he had every right to, they would escalate. They'd twist the story. They'd find an excuse. They always did. And he was outnumbered and powerless. Elijah inhaled sharply. His body was still sore from being thrown to the ground. His wrists ached from the tightness of the cuffs. His pride was already bruised and bleeding. Fighting them here now? It would only make things worse. His hands trembled with anger. But finally, he nodded. Fine. But inside, he was seething. As they marched him toward his front door, Elijah's mind spun. This wasn't just about the humiliation. This wasn't just about the injustice. This was about trust. He had lived in Oak Ridge Heights for 3 years, paid his bills, kept to himself, never caused trouble. And yet, the moment a white woman thought he looked suspicious, the police had shown up, guns drawn, ready to take him down without a single shred of evidence. It didn't matter who he was. It didn't matter that he was innocent. All that mattered was that he was black. And that, in their eyes, was reason enough. Karen still stood on her porch, her phone in her hand, watching like she had just performed some heroic act. Elijah turned his head slightly, locking eyes with her. For the first time, something flickered in her gaze. A brief hesitation. A crack in her confidence. Doubt. Maybe she had realized, deep down, that she had gone too far. Maybe she had finally seen what she had done. But it was too late. Elijah's life had already been disrupted. His dignity had already been shattered. And this was only the beginning. What would you do if you were in Elijah's shoes? Humiliated, powerless, treated like a criminal, just for existing in your own home. This is the ugly reality of racial bias, where assumptions can turn an innocent moment into a nightmare. Did this part make you angry? Frustrated? Show your support for Elijah by liking this video, dropping a comment, and sharing your thoughts. No one should have to go through this. But Elijah's fight isn't over. Stay with us, because in the next part, the truth begins to unravel, and what's uncovered will shock everyone. Keep watching. Elijah's hands were still trembling as he unlocked his phone, his fingers stiff from the too tight handcuffs that had just been removed. His breath was shallow, his heart still pounding with the lingering humiliation from being thrown to the ground. Every muscle in his body ached, from the impact, from the anger, from the sheer weight of the injustice that had just played out in front of his own home. But now wasn't the time to dwell on that. Now, he needed to prove what he already knew, that he wasn't the criminal here. Elijah's fingers moved quickly across his phone screen as he pulled up his router logs. The proof was right here. If these officers were half as interested in actual crimes as they were in harassing innocent black men in their own neighborhoods, then they would see it too. He turned the screen toward them, his voice tight. Here, look, this is my router's device list. That thing. The one labeled Oak Ridge 001. That's not mine. Detective Calloway leaned in, his eyes scanning the screen, his lips pressed into a thin, skeptical line. Even with evidence staring him in the face, he didn't want to believe Elijah. You could have made this up. Calloway's voice was cold, dismissive. This doesn't prove anything. Elijah felt his frustration spike like an electric shock. He clenched his jaw. Why would I hack into my own damn Wi-Fi? Why would I put myself through this? You just threw me to the ground like a goddamn criminal, and you still think I'm making this up? Calloway didn't flinch. He folded his arms over his chest, his eyes cold, unyielding. It's easy to fake a device name. I've seen cybercriminals do it before. Maybe you're the one running something shady. Maybe this is just a cover-up. Elijah's breath hitched in his chest. A cover-up? He stared at Calloway in disbelief, anger surging through him like wildfire. No matter what he did, no matter how much proof he had, they weren't going to believe him. They had already made up their minds the second they saw him. Officer Lane shifted uncomfortably. She had been quiet up until now, watching the exchange with calculating eyes, but something in Elijah's logs had caught her attention. She took a step closer, her brow furrowing. Wait a second. Elijah exhaled sharply, fighting to keep his patience. What? Lane pointed at the screen. Asterisk asterisk, this isn't just an unknown device. It's been connected for days, asterisk asterisk, and look at this. She tapped on a series of activity logs, her expression darkening. Elijah followed her finger, his stomach twisting into a knot. The IP logs weren't just showing internet usage. They were accessing video feeds. His breath caught in his throat. No. 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 He shook his head, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. Lane's voice was sharp, serious now. This isn't just Wi-Fi theft. Someone's been spying. Calloway stiffened. The doubt in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else, unease. Elijah swallowed hard, his pulse racing. Someone's been hacking into my security cameras. Lane's face paled as she scrolled through the logs. Not just yours. Elijah's blood ran cold. Calloway leaned in closer. What do you mean? Lane clicked deeper into the log files. One by one, camera feeds appeared, feeds from different homes, different addresses. This isn't one house. It's multiple. Elijah's mouth went dry. His hands felt numb as he took the phone back, his mind spinning. Someone in this neighborhood wasn't just stealing internet. They were watching people. They were watching him. Lane's breathing had turned shallow, her fingers hovering over the screen, almost afraid to touch it. Then she clicked on the most recent log entry, and a live camera feed popped up. The screen filled with an image, a dimly lit hallway, a framed painting, a leather couch barely visible in the corner. Elijah's stomach twisted into knots, and then a shadow moved. A woman, a familiar woman. Elijah heard the sharp intake of breath beside him. Then Lane's voice broke the silence like a gunshot. "Oh my God," she turned to Calloway, her face drained of color, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's my house." The world stopped. Calloway's entire demeanor shifted. The arrogance, the skepticism, it was gone. For the first time since arriving at Elijah's house, realization hit him. This was bigger than their prejudices. This was bigger than Elijah. Because now, they were the ones being watched too. Elijah felt like his lungs had collapsed. The weight of what he had just uncovered sank into his chest like a stone. Who the hell is watching people's homes? Lane whispered, her fingers curling into fists. Elijah's mind raced, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. How long has this been going on? Who else is being watched? Calloway was already reaching for his radio, his voice urgent. "We need cybercrime on this." Now, Elijah wasn't listening anymore. His mind was spinning. His stomach was churning. The invasion of privacy, the violation, it made his skin crawl. He had been living under surveillance. His home, his safe space, wasn't safe at all. And worse, neither was anyone else's. Elijah took a shaky breath, his hands curling into fists. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just an attack on him. This was a full-blown cybercrime. And the person responsible? They weren't far. Calloway looked at Elijah now, really looked at him, for the first time that night. And in his expression, Elijah saw what he had been waiting for all along. Belief, fear, and the realization that they had all been looking at the wrong suspect. The real threat? It was still out there, watching, waiting. And now? It knew they were coming. The air was thick with tension. The truth was out, but it wasn't over yet. Calloway and Lane stood rigid, eyes locked on the router logs, the live camera feed still flashing on the screen. This was bigger than anything they had expected. Someone had been watching them, watching their homes, watching their families. Elijah, still gripping his phone, felt the bitter taste of betrayal burning in his throat. He had been thrown to the ground, handcuffed, humiliated, all while the real criminal had been hiding in plain sight. And now? It was time to find out who was behind this. Calloway's radio crackled as he barked into it. "Dispatch, we need immediate cybercrime support. We've got unauthorized surveillance activity linked to multiple households." Elijah wasn't waiting. His mind was already piecing things together, tracing the source of the unauthorized connection. He tapped furiously, narrowing the IP address. Then his screen flashed with a final location. Elijah's stomach dropped. "No." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. The signal traced back to a house just a few doors down. Karen Whitmore's house. Karen, who had been standing smugly by, suddenly froze. She let out a stiff laugh, shaking her head. "That's impossible. There's no way." Elijah turned the screen toward her, eyes dark, voice cutting. "Then explain this." Karen's face paled as she stared at the IP logs. Her eyes flicked toward her house. Her jaw clenched. Then she whispered, almost afraid to say it aloud. "Marcus." Her nephew. The kid she had defended. The one she never once suspected. The one she had been so sure was different from Elijah. And yet, it was him. Karen stumbled back, her breath hitching. No, that can't be right." Lane and Calloway didn't hesitate. They were already moving. "Let's go. Now." Karen hesitated for just a second before following. And Elijah? Elijah wasn't about to let them do this without him. The walk down the street felt longer than it should have. Karen's hands trembled as she fumbled with her keys, pushing open the front door. The moment they stepped inside, the scent of stale coffee and electronics filled the air. Then came the clicking. From upstairs, the rapid, frantic clicking of a keyboard. "Marcus." Karen's voice shook. There was no response. Lane and Calloway were already rushing up the stairs. Elijah followed close behind, his chest tight with anger, his blood boiling with the injustice of it all. Calloway reached the door first, banging hard. "Marcus Whitmore. Open up." Nothing. Then, a chair scraping. More frantic clicks. "He's deleting files," Elijah yelled. Calloway didn't wait. With one brutal kick, the door flew open. Inside the dimly lit room, Marcus Whitmore was hunched over his computer, eyes wide, hands moving too fast over his keyboard. But he wasn't fast enough. Lane was on him in a second, grabbing his arm before he could shut the laptop. Marcus flinched, yelping like a child caught stealing. "What the hell is this?" Calloway demanded, shoving Marcus back against his chair. Elijah stood at the doorway, staring at the real criminal. The pale, scrawny college kid who had been violating people's privacy, and had gotten away with it. Until now. Marcus's face was slick with sweat. His hands twitched at his sides, eyes darting between the officers, his aunt, and Elijah. I don't know what this is about." His voice cracked. Lane snorted. She wasn't buying it. She yanked his laptop around, her fingers scrolling through files. Then she froze. "Oh my God." Calloway leaned in, and Elijah saw it. Folder after folder, labeled by house numbers. Videos, screenshots, logs of access times, some of them dating back over a year. Karen's voice was a strangled whisper. "Marcus, what have you done?" Marcus's shoulders sagged. His head dropped. Then, finally, his voice came as small, pathetic. "I just wanted to see if I could do it." The room went still. Elijah's breath hitched. His fingers curled into fists. Marcus swallowed hard, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "At first, it was just for fun. I was bored. I wanted to see if I could hack into a network. It wasn't hard." He let out a weak, dry laugh. "And then, I don't know. It got easy. I got curious." He looked up, eyes desperate. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted to see. He had ruined lives, violated privacy, turned homes into glass houses. And he had the nerve to say it was just curiosity?" Elijah's whole body was shaking. He took a slow step forward, his voice low, dangerous. "So let me get this straight." Marcus flinched. Elijah let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "You humiliated me, threw me in cuffs, slammed me into the pavement." He turned to Calloway, his voice sharp with fury. "All while this guy, this pale, privileged little genius, was the one watching your own homes." Calloway's jaw tensed. He had nothing to say. Karen wrapped her arms around herself, looking like she might throw up. She had been so sure, so certain, and she had been wrong. Again. "Marcus," Karen whispered. Marcus dropped his head into his hands. "I'm sorry. It was too late." Calloway pulled out his cuffs. "Marcus Whitmore, you're under arrest for unauthorized surveillance, illegal hacking, and violation of privacy laws." Marcus didn't resist. His shoulders slumped as Calloway snapped the cuffs around his wrists. Karen stood there, silent. Elijah? Elijah felt nothing. No satisfaction. No relief. Just exhaustion. Because in the end, he was still the one who had been humiliated. Still the one who had been tackled, accused, disrespected. And nothing would ever erase that. As Calloway led Marcus toward the door, Elijah caught Lane's gaze. For the first time, she looked at him with genuine regret. But regret wasn't enough. Nothing ever was. The house was eerily silent after Marcus was taken away. The flashing red and blue lights had faded, leaving nothing but the echo of injustice hanging in the air. The same neighbors who had stood on their porches, watching Elijah get slammed into the pavement, were now peeking out from behind their curtains, too ashamed to step forward. But Elijah saw them, and he would never forget. The same people who had silently judged him. The same people who had let it happen. And now? Now they couldn't even look him in the eye. Karen Whitmore stood near her porch, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face pale with shame. She took a hesitant step toward Elijah. Her mouth opened, then closed. Then finally, she spoke. I didn't know. Her voice was small, cracking at the edges. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears. I was wrong about you. Elijah laughed bitterly. A slow, hollow, humorless laugh. She flinched. He turned to her, his voice cold, measured. You didn't know? He repeated, his tone like a knife. You didn't know? Or you never even questioned it? Karen's lips trembled. Elijah stepped closer, towering over her now, his fury controlled but undeniable. You just saw a black man standing outside his own damn home and assumed the worst. Karen's eyes glistened with tears. I wasn't thinking. No, Elijah cut her off. You were thinking. You were thinking exactly what people like you always think. That I didn't belong. That I was a threat. That I was a criminal. And you know what? He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. You're not sorry you did it. Her breath hitched. You're sorry you were wrong. Karen had nothing to say. Because he was right.